Hi there, this is Kimberly McKenna. I'm a third grade teacher at Sycamore Trails, and I will be reading Chapter 8 and a little bit of Chapter 9 from The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. 2 weeks after I buried my dog, cholera swept our district. Doctors said the sickness started in southern Malawi back in November. A farmer visiting a funeral brought it north, where it spread like grass fire. Within days, hundreds of people were sick and 12 had died. Cholera is a highly contagious infection that causes severe diarrhea. People mostly get it by eating food or drinking water that's been contaminated with feces. Across Africa, it's an unfortunate companion of every rainy season. Many villages have poorly built latrines that flood with the rains and pollute the wells and streams where people drink. Blowflies also spread the bacteria after crawling out of toilets and landing on food. The diarrhea that results is clear and milky and quickly leads to dehydration. If people aren't treated immediately, they could die. During the famine, people out looking for food became unwitting carriers. The cholera struck them on the roads and forced them to become sick in the bush. Rain, flies, and cockroaches then spread the infection onto the banana peels, roots, and corn husks that others had picked up to eat. To combat the cholera, the clinic at the trading center started giving away chlorine to clean our drinking water. For months, it tasted like metal. They also advised families to cover the holes of their latrines to keep out the flies. My father made a lid from a piece of iron sheeting, but as soon as it was removed, the fat green blowflies swarmed out like a biblical plague and smashed into your head and face. It was a lot of work trying to swat them and finish your business at the same time. In those days, any signs of diarrhea near the latrine hole caused alarm. Each morning, the cholera people walked past our house on their way to the clinic, their eyes cloudy and skin wrinkled from dehydration. I'd watch them until they got close, then run down the trail toward home. But as soon as they passed, the starving people would follow. Between hunger and cholera, we had many funerals in Wimby. At home, Jeffrey's anemia grew worse. His legs became grotesquely swollen with kwashiorkor. If you touched his foot, your finger left a mark on his bubbled skin, as if the foot were made of clay. "Can you feel it?" I asked one day, touching the blisters. "Does it hurt?" "I can't feel anything," he said. He also became dizzy and had trouble walking a straight line. One afternoon I was taking him outside into the sunshine, but he stopped and said, "Wait, come back. I can't see." We stood there until his eyes adjusted to the light before we continued. For months his mother had only served him pumpkin leaves, and now, like Kamba, my cousin, was starving to death. With little else to do, my mother took half our flour for the day and gave it to Jeffrey's mother. "There's enough here for porridge," she told her. "It isn't much, but I can't watch my own family suffer." We were all losing weight, especially me. The bones were now showing in my chest and shoulders, and the rope belt that I'd made for my pants no longer worked. Now I just pinched 2 belt loops together and tied them off with a stick, twisting more as I got thinner. My arms and legs looked like blue gum holes and ached all the time. I had trouble squeezing my hand into a fist. One afternoon, I was pulling weeds in the field when my heart started racing so fast I lost my breath and nearly fainted. "What's happening with me?" I thought. Terrified, I bent down slowly until my knees touched the dirt, then stayed there until my pulse returned to normal and I could breathe again. That same night, I sat in my room with a lantern while the hunger played games with my mind. If I sat still enough, the walls began to spin in slow circles like a merry-go-round. I followed a centipede up the wall for what seemed like hours. When a mayfly flew close to the lantern, I grabbed it by the wings and asked, "How are you alive? What are you eating?" One thing was certain: no magic can save us now. Starving was a cruel kind of science. Even my father, Once a giant man, shriveled like a raisin. Sharp bones now replaced brawny muscle. His teeth seemed bigger, his hair was thinner, and for once I noticed the scars on his skin. One afternoon he reported having seen across the courtyard. The hunger was robbing his vision, but Geoffrey, just as it had Geoffrey's. It seemed the thinner my father became, the more he wanted to weigh himself. He kept a maize scale hanging by a rope near the tool shed, and one morning I watched his routine. He walked out and gripped the hook, then hung it there like a sack of grain. Then hung there like a sack of grain, staring up at the needle. He made a grunting sound and said, 5 kilos, Mama. As always, Mother came and looked, but refused to weigh herself. The children were also forbidden. Like many women during the hunger, she started crying her mapango tight around her waist like a belt. She said it confused her stomach and tricked her heart from beating fast, helping her to breathe. At night, she resorted to mind games to help us children. You're losing weight because you're thinking about food, she told us. You don't know what causes your body. Don't you know that causes your body to stress and burn more energy? My sisters cried. Aisha said, but Mama, I don't want to become swollen. Then think about positive things, my mother told her. Do that for me. The one positive thing we could dwell on was our maize crop. Out in the field, the stalks had grown as high as my father's chest. The ears of corn began to form, revealing traces of red silk on their heads, and the leaves and stalks were fading from deep green to yellow. While men withered and died all around us, our plants were coming up fat and strong. 20 days, I predicted to my father. I'd say you're right. If I was indeed correct, then we had 20 days until the green maize was ripe enough to eat, what we lovingly called dough. It's equivalent to the American corn on the cob when the kernels are soft and sweet and pop between your teeth. All day and night I dreamed of dough. By the beginning of March, the maize stalks had reached my father's head. At this stage, the flowers told you everything. Once the red and yellow silk began to dry and turn brown, you could start checking for dough. I'd go from stalk to stalk, pinching the cob to feel the grain. If the kernels crushed easily under my fingers, it was too early. But if they felt firm, then it was time. Every morning for a week, Geoffrey and I walked up and down the rows, pointing out the ones that were nearly done. Then, finally, I spotted a cob that appeared right and gave it a squeeze. It was firm. This one's ready, I said. Yeah, said Geoffrey, pointing to another. And so is this one, and this one, and this one. Our long-awaited day has finally arrived. Let's eat. Using the last of our energy, we ran through the rows, pulling the ripe dough and cradling them in our arms. Soon I had 15 ears, and Geoffrey had the same. We peeled back the first layer of husks and tied them all together, then draped the chain across our shoulders. The sight of Geoffrey and me running through the courtyard with necklaces of dough nearly caused a riot. It's ready? Aisha asked, her eyes wide and excited. Ready. The dough is ready. In the kitchen, I stoked the coals of my mother's fire until they burned red. Soon my sisters were crowded inside the door, fighting for space. Relax, I shouted. There's plenty of dough for everyone. I placed several cobs directly on the coals, then flipped them until the peels were crisp and blackened. I turned my fingers, pulling one off, then stripped the steaming husks and began to eat. The kernels were meaty and warm and filled with the essence of God. I chewed long and slow. Each time I swallowed, I was returning something that had gone missing long ago. Looking up, I saw my parents in the doorway. I don't think this dough is ready, my father said, snatching one off the fire. He pulled off the silk and took his first bite. Within seconds, the blood of life seemed to rush back into his face. He knew he would live. It's ready, he said, and smiled. That afternoon, we must have eaten 30 ears of maize. As if heaven opened up, the first pumpkins in our field were also ready. My mother boiled them, seeds and all, then served up baskets of steaming meat. My God, to have a stomach filled with warm food was one of the greatest pleasures in life. Geoffrey and his mother started coming over and enjoying meals of pumpkin dough with us. Soon the swelling in Jeffrey's legs went away, and he was smiling like his old self. For Jeffrey and me, March was like one big celebration. Each morning before work, we made a fire in the fields and ate a big breakfast of roasted maize and pumpkins. I remembered a parable that Jesus told to the disciples, the one about the sower of seeds. The one about the sower of seeds. The seeds planted along the road get stepped on and damaged. Those planted in rocky soil can't take root, and the ones planted in the thorns get tangled in the barbs. But the seeds planted on fertile soil live and prosper. Mr. Jeffrey, we're like those seeds planted on fertile soil, not on the roadside, stepped on by everyone walking past us. No, no, not us. That's right. We lived. We survived. Page 137, Chapter 9, The Library. All across the district, the Dow and Pumpkins were like a great army marching to save us from certain death. Of course, our lives wouldn't return to normal until the harvest, which was still 2 months away. And at night, the same blob of Nesima greeted us at supper. But at least it was the start of something better. In the trading center, people began to smile and talk about the future. As the district slowly reclaimed its energy, students at Cachacolo returned to school to resume their studies. But since my parents couldn't afford my fees, I was forced to stay home. Besides some weeding, there was little work to do in the fields until harvest. I spent a lot of time in the trading center playing bow wow. Someone also taught me a wonderful game called chess, which I played every day. But these games weren't enough to keep my mind stimulated. I needed a better hobby, something to trick my brain into being happy. Day and night, all I could think about was school. I missed it terribly. Then I remembered that a small library had opened the previous year in Wimby Primary. It was started by a group of young Malawi teacher training. It was started by a group called the Malawi Teacher Training Authority, and all the books were donated by the American government. Perhaps reading would keep my brain from getting mushy. The library was housed in a small room by the main office. I entered and was greeted by a nice lady who smiled and said, "Come to borrow some books?" This was Miss Edith Sikello, who taught English and social studies at Wimby and acted as the school librarian. I nodded. Then I asked, "How do I do it?" It was my first time ever seeing such a thing. Miss Sikello pulled back a curtain to reveal 3 giant shelves that nearly reached the ceiling, each filled with books. The air smelled fresh and musty, an aroma I'd find comforting from that day forward. She explained the rules of borrowing books, then showed me the many titles available. I expected to find primary teachers and others borrowing Malawian textbooks. But to my surprise, these books came from all over the world, places like America, England, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. I saw books on English, history, and science, even novels for leisurely reading. I spent hours that morning sitting on the floor, flipping through pages and marveling at the pictures. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to escape without going anywhere. The books from other countries were especially fascinating, but I'd ended up checking out some Malawian textbooks my friends were studying at school. It was the end of the semester, and my plan was to get caught up before classes started again. Back at home, I fashioned a hammock from flour sacks and strung it between 2 trees. I spent my mornings at the library, and during the warm afternoons, I read in the shade. Right away, Gilbert offered to help with my independent studies. Each day after school, he stopped by and explained the lessons. "What did you cover in science?" I'd ask. "Weather patterns." "Can I get your notes?" "For sure." But as much as I loved to read, I found it terribly difficult. For one, my English was bad, and sounding out words took a great deal of time and energy. Plus, some of the material was confusing since I didn't have a teacher to explain things. In agriculture, I asked Gilbert, "What do they mean by weathering?" "It's when rain breaks apart the rocks and soil." "Ah, got it." One Saturday, Gilbert met me at the library just to look at books for fun. He couldn't study all the time. The first thing I spotted was the Malawi Junior Integrated Science book, used by the older high school students. Inside were lots of diagrams and photos of strange and interesting things, people with rabies and children sickened with kwashiorkor, like so many who'd wandered our country. One picture showed a man in a puffy silver suit. "What's happening here?" I asked. "It says he's walking on the moon," Gilbert said. "Impossible." Turning the pages, I saw a photo of Nakula Falls on the Shire River, located in southern Malawi. It's where Eskom operated the hydro plant I mentioned earlier, and where the country got its electricity. The only information I had was that the river flowed downhill until it reached the plant. Then, poof, there was power. How and why this worked, I had no clue. But this book explained everything. It said the water turned the giant wheel at the plant called a turbine, and the turbine produced the electricity. "Well," I told Gilbert, "this sounds exactly like a bicycle dynamo. It lights the bulb by also turning a wheel." The photo at Nakula Falls made me think about the Dumbo behind my house. During the rainy season, there was always a waterfall. "What if I put a dynamo underneath it?" I said. "The falling water could do the spinning and produce electricity. We could listen to the radio whenever we wanted." "The only problem would be running wires all the way to my house, which will cost a fortune. But what would I do the rest of the year when the marsh was just a soggy swamp?" "Guess I'll have to research this a little more," I said. Later that day, we came across another fascinating book called Explaining Physics. It was also filled with pictures and illustrations, mainly from England. To my surprise, it answered many of the questions I'd been asking for a long time, such as how engines burned gasoline in order to move, or how CD players read music on that shiny disc. For those of you wondering, the same, it uses a laser beam. I found an entire section on batteries. Another photo demonstrated how brakes on a car worked. I'd always assumed that cars used strips of rubber to stop the wheels like on a bicycle. This book said otherwise. "Vacuum brakes?" I said. "Wow, Gilbert, I really need to borrow this book." But explaining physics was way more difficult to read than integrated science. The words and phrases were long and complicated and not always easy to translate. After a while, I devised my own system by reading words in context. For example, if I was interested in a photo labeled Figure 10 and I didn't know what it meant, I'd comb through the text until I found where Figure 10 was mentioned. Then I'd study all of the words and sentences around it, often asking Mrs. Sickello to look them up in a dictionary. "Can you look up the word voltage?" I asked. "Sure. Any others?" "Resistor. Oh, and diode. Diode. Slowly, this is how I began learning English, as well as the sciences that would soon capture my imagination. After a couple weeks of reading this book, I came across the most amazing chapter, the discussion of magnets. I knew little about magnets because they're found in radio speakers. I'd busted off a few and taken them to school as toys, moving slivers of metal around through a small piece of paper. The book explained how magnets have north and south poles. The north pole of one magnet will stick to the south pole of another, while identical poles always resist. You've probably experienced this yourself when playing around with these things. In fact, the Earth itself has a liquid iron core that acts like a giant magnet bar in relation to its poles. Magnets, like the Earth, have natural force fields that radiate between the poles. The south end of a barred magnet will always be pulled toward the north pole of the Earth. That's how a compass works. The bar magnet inside always pulls north to keep you from getting lost. The most fascinating section was about electromagnets, which work by applying power to a coil of wire. According to the book, you can make them out of everyday objects such as nails and batteries. When electricity from a power source, such as a battery, passes through a coil of water, it creates a magnetic field. This magnetic field can be even greater if the wire is wrapped around a good conductor like a nail. The more it's wrapped, the stronger the electromagnet. The strength can also be increased by using thicker wire or by applying more power. The book showed giant electromagnets picking up cars and heavy pieces of metal. but smaller ones, it explained, help power simple motors in things like radios and car alternators. Aha, I said. They're talking about radios. I was sitting in my hammock when I read this piece of information. It had taken me over a month to get this far in the chapter, mainly because of all the strange English words to learn. But now I'd reached the juiciest part. How do the motors work? Well, in a simple electric motor, a coil of wire on a shaft sits inside a casing that's actually a large magnet. I knew this by taking apart radio motors and unraveling the copper wire, mainly to make toys and stuff. When this coil of wire is connected to a battery or any power source and becomes magnetized, it gets all charged up and wants to fight with the larger magnet surrounding it. The push and pull between the opposing poles causes the shaft to spin. You know the fans that were used in the summer to keep cool? The blades are spinning around and around because of this fight going on inside. During all this fighting and spinning around, these motors produce their own kind of energy called alternating current, or AC. There's a second kind of energy called a direct current, or DC, and that's mostly found in batteries. Direct current flows in one direction from one end of the battery to the other, while AC changes directions and can be used in more ways. It's also easier to transmit. Because of this, most electronics use AC power. The book gave an example of an AC generating motor, a bicycle dynamo. Aha, I said again, remembering back when Jeffrey and I were playing with the dynamo and trying to power the radio. It didn't work when we'd attach the wires to the battery terminal, which only used direct current. But when we jammed them into a hole that said AC, the radio had come to life. The book went on. The movement energy of the dynamo is provided by the rider. Of course, I thought, that's how spinning motion generates power in a dynamo and in the Eskom turbines on the river.